My name is Bijl de Vroe, and this is an English episode of the Club Groeneveld podcast, Back to Nature, where I have conversations with inspiring people about the art of being human, how to live a meaningful life, and the search for our place in the world. Our hope is that anyone who listens to these conversations will be inspired to look inside themselves and maybe ask questions about their own humanity and their own place on this miraculous world. Questions we too often forget to ask ourselves. In this episode, I have a conversation with Stephen Batchelor. Stephen is a contemporary Buddhist teacher and writer, best known for his secular or agnostic approach to Buddhism. Stephen considers Buddhism to be a constantly evolving culture of awakening rather than a religious system based on immutable dogmas and beliefs. Stephen was born in Scotland in 1953, and after completing grammar school, he travelled overland to India at the age of 18. He settled in Dharamsala, the capital-in-exile of the Dalai Lama, where he studied Buddhist philosophy. After becoming a Buddhist monk, he continued his studies in various countries before settling in France, where he has lived since 2000. There he pursues his work as a scholar, writer and artist. For several months each year, he travels worldwide to lead meditation retreats and teach Buddhism. He is the translator and author of various books and articles on Buddhism, including the bestselling Buddhism Without Beliefs and Confession of a Buddhist Atheist. His most recent publication is The Art of Solitude, which came out just before the COVID crisis hit. In our conversation, we talk about the importance of realigning oneself with the natural world, the different ways of experiencing life, be it skimming over the surface or finding a depth within your experience that allows you to get to grips with the core questions of who you are. About rediscovering the mysterious and how philosophy begins in wonder. The difficult question of how to know what is right and just. The ultimate importance of life not in an abstract sense, but in a concrete sense. Or the question how to actually lead a good life. About finding out that it is the process that matters, the constant process of learning, which requires humility, openness, and a sense of humor. And the fact that, in a sense, the more you know, the less you know. Okay, so officially we are recording. Yeah, you can see it as well. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Stephen, so great that you could join us on this Club Groeneveld, Club Greenfield podcast.
Thank you, Louis. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope we're going to have a good conversation.
Me too. Normally, this podcast is actually translated, it's called Back to Nature. Uh-huh. And it was inspired mainly because we thought it would be a great idea if we just had a conversation while walking through nature. Oh. That was the idea of it, because conversations in nature, conversations while walking are different. However, obviously, we are not walking and we are not in nature. We're inside. But my first question would always be, where are we? So my first question now for you, where, if I asked you to go any place with me to walk and to have a conversation, where would we be walking right now in that case?
We would be walking through the vineyards and forests around the village in France where I live, which is built a village that was created out of a forest, and the village is called La Sauve Majeure, which is a French corruption of Silva Majoris, the Great Wood. And a monk came here in the 12th century and had a vision in the wood of the Virgin, who suggested that he establish a community. And he established the foundations for a monastery by clearing the woodland, by making some of the land around arable. They planted vines, and that became both the spiritual and the economic foundation for the life that goes on here today. The abbey is now in ruins, but the wine business is doing very, very well. And so if we were together, we would be walking through vineyards which are now bereft of leaves, and forests likewise, and countryside and rolling hills. That's where we would be.
Wow. And did you know this story before you moved there? Did you know about this?
Yeah, sure. I'm speaking to you now from where I live, which is the family home of my wife. And her family has owned this house since about 1940. It's an older house than that. And so when I returned back from being a monk in Asia, I would spend every summer here. Oh, so wow. I gradually got to know the story of this place, this community, its history. And to me, it means a great deal. It connects me to the place in a way that living in a suburb of Bordeaux would not. And I'm very, very close to, what happened here in the past and how this community came to be. And I love the combination of both the religious dimension and the natural dimension, the green fields, as it were, and the farming.
Yeah, and you said the monastery is in ruins. Yes. The wine business is booming. This could be telling of our modern times. I don't know if that's the case. But are there any spiritual? Do you feel any? Is there any remnants, spiritual remnants there besides nature, or do you feel it's all wine right now?
No, there are. You see, to me, I love old religious buildings. Whether they're in ruins or not doesn't really matter to me. I love being able to go to the ruins of this abbey. It's not a total ruin. You can visit it. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's kind of important, and it's got beautiful Romanesque carvings still visible around the ruin. But in another village about 5 kilometers from here called Saint-Genès-de-Lambeau, that is a church, a small church that goes back, actually goes back to a Roman villa, which was here about 2,000 years ago, on which they built a church. And in the Middle Ages, they enshrined a wooden black Madonna. And that still, every year they have a procession. They take the Madonna around the church, and that is still a functioning church. To me, these old religious artifacts really is what they are. Have always meant a lot to me, because they carry within them the memory of the community. That there would, for hundreds of years, people have revered this object, this piece of wood. But that to me is what preserves a community in time. And also this piece of wood, this black Madonna, it will outlive all of us. And it'll probably be here in another 500 years. And so there's a sense that although you're in a very temporary environment, a wine industry and all the other stuff, there's something constant that keeps reminding us that this is not the whole story. That there's a set of values, a set of human longings, a certain sense of the sacred that continues, maybe not noticed, maybe hidden, maybe in ruins, but it's still there as a reminder of what really matters in life, what the real, crux of being human means.
And it also brings a form of universality to the timeless.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the religious symbols really are something outside the secular realm. They remind us of something that doesn't just rise and pass away in the course of, a generation, but they are something that transcends the temporary and evokes something more important, perhaps something more lasting. And I think it's important to be even France is a very secular society. These churches are barely attended anymore. It's all falling apart. The religion in France is called laïcité, secularization, basically. And although I very much value the French secular culture, liberté, égalité, fraternité, I think these are wonderful values to build on. I also feel that, there's something else that perhaps has been lost.
Mm. Yeah, well, before we go into that, because I think that's something that is very important right now also to unpack. I want to ask you because, well, it's almost February 2021. So it's almost in Western Europe. I'm calling from the Netherlands. I think March was the month when we realized that a virus doesn't care about borders so much. So almost a year into it, and just before, I think in 2000 and in June 2019, I guess, you released the book The Art of Solitude. Am I correct?
Well, actually, no, it was even closer. The Art of Solitude was published in February
Wow.
last year, 2020. I flew to the United States at the beginning of February, just when the news was now beginning to talk of some SARS-like virus in China. It was sort of there in the background.
Yeah.
And the book was published by Yale University Press. So I went to New York, I went to Boston, and then I traveled across the states to New Mexico and then to Arizona. And then when I got to Los Angeles, which was the last stop on my tour, it was the 12th of March, I think. And then we knew that something very serious was happening. And I'd just been sort of running to keep ahead of it. So The Art of Solitude came out at a curiously appropriate moment. Not that I had anything to do with this, of course. It was just another sign of, I don't know, whatever rules these things.
Yeah.
But curiously, yes, I had written a book about an experience that people were just about to, find out about for themselves.
Yeah, if they wanted to or not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe then it could be very interesting for everyone at home to pick up their ears to listen about this Art of Solitude. But maybe first, could you explain about your own history in solitude, because it started when you were at quite a young age. And it didn't have anything to do with a virus or anything. You decided on your own that solitude might be worth exploring by yourself. Could you maybe tell a little bit of your history of solitude?
Okay. Well, I think in some ways it was prompted by a virus. If we take virus metaphorically, it was prompted with my seeking to find refuge from consumerist capitalism, broadly speaking, modern Western society. And that, as a teenager, I was already somehow rebelling against what I thought of as the sort of, the rather corrupt, militaristic, industrial world in which we lived. And like many young people in the 60s, I was attracted to the wisdom of Asia. I was attracted to the experimentation in forms of different levels of consciousness, of meditation, of yoga. And as soon as I was I was legally old enough to leave England after the age of 18. I finished my schooling, I worked in a factory, I earned some money, and I hightailed it for India. And I traveled overland for a few months and then arrived in Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama lives, in the Himalayan foothills in the August 1972. And that moment was essentially when I began the career, though that's maybe vocation is possibly a better word, that I'm still pursuing now. In other words, I became deeply involved in Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism at the time. I learned the Tibetan language, I translated classical texts, I became a monk, and I took all of this terribly seriously. And I think it was in many ways a reaction against having been brought up outside any kind of religious framework. My family were not Christian. They were sort of vaguely humanist. And I felt that something was missing in my upbringing, in the culture in which I grew up. And I was extraordinarily impressed and moved by the Tibetan people, not just the lamas and the Dalai Lama, but these ordinary people who had fled from their homeland in 1959, which was then only 12 years earlier, and were washed up in India as refugees with basically nothing. And they'd lost their country, they'd lost their culture, they'd had friends and family destroyed, and yet they had this extraordinary warmth and wisdom and care and love for hippies like me. And I'd never really encountered any people like that before. And they were a lot more impressive than any representatives of the Church of England I'd ever come across. And of course, they were terribly exotic. I mean, that you can't rule that out either. I mean, this was romantic idealism going a bit crazy at this point. But, you're in the Himalayas, there's Tibetan lamas wandering around there, offering you these teachings. You've got nothing else to do. I was not 18, 19 years old. And so I just dived in. And it was the best move I ever made, I think. I mean, that has informed my life right up until now. It's been what's given me a sense of meaning and purpose and value. And now, of course, I'm interested in finding ways to communicate these values, but maybe not within a strict Buddhist framework. I think there's a limitation by containing, such ideas and philosophies within the religion of Buddhism. And that's where, in a sense, my own life has been very much about that, trying to give voice to what I've learned, but in a language that speaks to the condition of our times.
And you say you actually you experienced this feeling of suppression almost, or not belonging in this materialistic capitalistic framework in which we in the 60s and still obviously. How did this come to pass? How did do you still remember? Can you pinpoint the moment when you start feeling this isn't my, because for a child, I guess you were a child at that moment. It can be kind of harsh growing up in a society to which you feel you probably don't belong. How did that develop? Do you still remember?
Well, I remember it quite clearly, but I think the crucial thing to be aware of here is that I wasn't alone. There was a subculture. It was called the 1960s. You may be too young to remember. But there was a whole movement that began in the early 60s with the music, Beatles, all that kind of stuff. And the whole underground, what we used to call the underground culture, the music was very, very central to it, but also a questioning of all values, a real sense of, do we want to live like our parents live? And so this was really a communal conversation. And I remember being at school, and the kids at the school, some of them were growing their hair and wearing beads, and others were not. They couldn't quite see the point of this. But there was a subculture within my immediate circle of friends, within the sort of the literature, the magazines, the music, a lot of it coming from the United States as well. And also, crucially, psychedelic drugs. This was part and parcel of it, cannabis, LSD. These were things that, once you somehow opened your mind to what they revealed, you realized that, human consciousness is not just what our parents told us it was all about. It's not just about conforming to society. There are actually capacities within the human being that are not accounted for in what I was being told at school. One of the key moments was when I was in the sixth form, which means when I was 17 years old, say. And we had a class at school which was a little bit outside the curriculum, called Means and Ends. I don't know why. But the one thing I remember from that is that the teacher presented us with Plato's allegory of the cave. You no doubt know that. A bunch of people stuck in a cave, looking at a wall, and they just see the shadowy images projected on the wall. And they think that's all there is, that's reality. And then the philosopher, or the proto-philosopher amongst the group, says, well, wait a minute, maybe there's something more than this. And so they find their way out of the cave, and they go into the sunlight, and wow, they see the world as it really is, rich with color and light and beauty and complexity. And then they go back into the cave, but nobody wants to listen to them. And so that was a moment. The fact that it sticks in my mind obviously says something. But what was the value of Plato's allegory was that it's for the first time made sense of some of these other non-normal, non-rational experiences that were experienced through psychedelics, through the music, through the subculture, through dancing all night and getting high and all that kind of thing. And you think, oh, wow, you know, now there's maybe Plato's cave is basically saying there is another way to experience reality. A crucial thing too at that time was being introduced to a book called Be Here Now by Ramdas. He died last year.
Yeah.
Great influence on me in many ways. And he had just published this book, which basically charted his movement from psychedelics to Indian spirituality. And he also went off to India, and he became a student of a man called Neem Karoli Baba, a Hindu sort of sage. And that was the book that really tied everything together for me. Wow. Plato's Cave, psychedelics, spirituality, India, the East, and that probably prompted my move to leave England and just find out what's going on in the rest of the world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's. I've been thinking about this more and more. I was born in 1985. So I'm part of a generation. Yeah, exactly. And
it's a little bit later. Okay.
But I actually, well, thinking of my generation, it's the generation that has been brought up in the 90s, where, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and we were heading towards the end of history, where we just had to find and create more democracies, liberal democracies, and capitalism will rule and secularism will rule, and then that will be it. And we were heading towards the perfect apotheosis of society. And then obviously from 2001 onward, this didn't quite happen. But as you explained, the generation from where you came from, there was a lot of fire and there was this longing for a different world. And I just remember my generation of complacency almost. And we have everything we want, we have freedoms, and there was no need, or I don't feel much need for the idea that we really need to change the way what we're doing. And I actually didn't know what to do, so I started studying philosophy. But then philosophy was a very cognitive business, so I learned to think well. But this is something different from thinking from a bigger perspective, really trying to understand what's going on, and really finding that the way we are actually living this world isn't, and from 2001 onwards, this became more and more apparent that we are actually in trouble, the way we live our lives and the way we do our daily business. And now you see, I think there's a new generation coming up that's actually coming up in a world that's in chaos and in absolute distress and in need of reform. But it's interesting that from different generations, there's just this, you see complacency, and then you see there's generations like the 60s where there's really the need for renewal. And do you think right now there's a moment where these generations can converge and agreeing in a sense that maybe what we've learned in the 60s, what we learned in the 70s and 80s and 90s now can converge to something as a new world view?
I hope so. But you see, Martine and I don't have children, so we don't really have much contact with people of your generation. And that's why I actually rather enjoy speaking with you, because I don't really know your experience or those of your generation at all. And when I teach retreats and I get letters from people who read my books, most of them are, they're not in their 20s. They're usually slightly older. They're a bit like me, basically. But it's true that over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly, I've started getting more interest in my work from people of the younger generation. And to me, that's extraordinarily important. And I noticed that these young people are coming to me with the sort of questions I brought to India,
Right.
if you like. I'm not so sure whether it's about convergence, although that I think would be part of this meeting of minds. But I would actually feel that what is needed is another kind of leap of consciousness. Yes, we have similar questions, but on the other hand, you know, us old hippies from the 60s, you know, we didn't exactly change the world. I mean, the things that we rebelled against then are still in place now. If arguably they're more entrenched. And so to what extent was, you know, all this meditation and so on, it must have made some impact, I guess, at some level. But I feel that the kind of threats, existential threats that we face today are such that it's leading to more and more people really questioning, you know, what is this life all about? Do I really want to sustain a form of economy and society, which is effectively and quite predictably going to divest the world of resources? It's going to increasingly contaminate the environment in which we live, and that, according to certain what seem to be reliable projections, make this planet more or less uninhabitable even within the course of this century. Yeah. Now, if you really start to take those ideas, and these are not just theories, this is backed up by lots of scientific data. If you're really going to take that on board, then I think the kind of things we were rebelling against in the 60s are relatively trivial in some ways. And when, it's not just a question of rebellion for the sake of rebellion's sake. It's actually about deep existential questions of how to live on this earth. And that is what I would value would be that is a cross-generational concern, that it's not tied to the ideas of 60-year-olds or 30-year-olds. That doesn't matter anymore. We have, I think, to get out of that. I think so much more is at stake in our current situation. And so whatever I've learned or others have learned from Tibetan lamas or Buddhism or meditation or whatever, that can feed into the equation. But I certainly don't advocate that Buddhism, for example, or any other particular form of religion or philosophy or whatever is going to have all the answers. It's not. This has got to be, I think, a rainbow coalition type situation where people of different backgrounds, different faiths, different ways of thinking begin to pool their resources and really learn to live together and to act together to address their common concerns, not the concerns of their generation, but really deep human common concerns. I think we are in a situation now where the world is far more connected than it ever was in the 60s. Marshall McLuhan, who was one of our sort of mentor type figures at that time, coined the idea of the global village, but it really was an idea then, a very seductive idea. But now we live in it. It's called the internet. Yeah. It's a worldwide web, which is essentially a hugely socially connected realm of interaction. And that's something we could never have imagined when I was your age, for example. And yet this has now become just, this is the medium in which we live, it's the water in which we swim. Right. And so I think we're in a situation now where it's increasingly difficult to think of ourselves as somehow able to persist as a national group or as a religious group. That all sounds increasingly outdated, and right. Seeking to sort of dominate one cultural ideal over all others again is rather parochial, and I think it's past its sell-by date really. How we're going to work this out, I don't know. If we're going to work this out, I don't know, really. And I think also we have to have the humility that just by coming up with clever technology will somehow solve the problem. I don't think it's got to do with technologies. Technologies can help, but if we don't fundamentally realign ourselves with the natural world in all its aspects, if we come in, what I feel personally is that human beings just insignificant numbers, need to really come into a different form of relationship with life itself, with the natural world in particular. And I'm very skeptical of solutions that are about what happens after death. And that most religions, in fact, what ties religions together, Buddhist, Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, is the fact that, yes, the world is a bit of a mess and you're going to die, but there's a solution after death. You'll get to heaven or you'll go to some nice place.
Quite the solution as well.
Sorry?
The best solution as well. It's quite the solution, right?
It's a final solution.
Yeah.
If you want. But unfortunately, it really means you can. The crises on planet Earth are really of kind of insignificant.
Right.
That they are. This is just a brief passage of time of a spiritual being or a soul who is really got to keep eternity in its sights.
Yeah.
And Buddhism is, promotes that as much as any other religion. And I feel that can be dangerous because we don't give sufficient attention to the really pressing needs of survival on planet Earth. And as far as we know, and there's no evidence to the contrary, this is the only place in the universe, perhaps, where these forms of complex life have come to be. I mean, statistically, there's likely to be a lot more, but we don't actually know.
Right.
We really don't know. And I would prefer to base the life I lead on the basis of what I know for sure. And the only thing I really know for sure is that living conscious beings have emerged on this planet. That's all I know. That's all I can be certain of. The rest is speculation. And religions, I think, often push us into beliefs about other realms and other forms of being and so on that people might be very convinced about. But there's no evidence.
Right.
It's just faith, really.
So that
it's consolatory. It's what it makes you feel good to believe that. Nobody wants to die.
So that begs the question, how to live together and how to create this world where we're not heading to, extinction, because as you said, nobody wants to die. And you talked about how we have to find a way in which to find a common ground, find a universal common humanity that belongs to all of us, because it really doesn't make sense to have borders and have different language or have different countries going against each other. So that asks the question, where and how to find this common humanity. What is there in us that's the same in all of us? What's universally human? And maybe that gets back to your book as well, Solitude, in which you also state that in finding solitude, when you have found the solitude inside yourself, then the outside starts begging again to interact with it. And could you maybe talk a little bit about how solitude may help in finding, well, your own humanity maybe to start with, but also maybe a common humanity?
Well, I think the value of solitude, I mean, you can think of solitude in two ways. There's the sort of the caricature of solitude, which is the person who goes off into a mountain and lives in a cave and is all by themselves, or a monk in a cell or whatever. And that's certainly, it's a form of solitude, clearly. But if you read Christian mystics, if you read Buddhist monks, if you read Sufi saints, they all recognize that just because you physically put yourself into an isolated place, once you get used to it, i.e. within about 48 hours, all the old stuff just keeps bubbling up again. And you're basically just bored and lonely and anxious and neurotic like you were before. So the real solitude, and again, Christians and Buddhists completely agree on, there's a Montaigne who I talk about in the book, it's very clear about this, is that you need to create an inner solitude. In other words, meditation or prayer, whichever or whatever means you use, is a way of somehow freeing yourself from all of those thoughts and fears and anxieties and so forth and so on that are constantly crowding in on you, that prevent you from really being alone with yourself. You're not alone with yourself. Try and meditate. Try and just stay with your breath for 5 minutes. And you'll notice, if you haven't done it before particularly, that, after about 5 nanoseconds, you've got millions of voices telling you to do this, that, and the other. You're lost in your memories and your plans and your fantasies, and your mind's totally out of control. It's and that's a great revelation. Again, that's part of our common humanity. Our minds are out of control in many ways. We're just driven by cultural forces, psychological forces, religious beliefs, and so on. So the practice of solitude is the practice of creating within oneself a non-reactive, aware, conscious space that's not constantly being interrupted and undermined by other agendas, and to sustain that space. And it's in that still open space that we can begin to cultivate another relationship to the world in which we live. And that world in which we live, the natural world, is not just what's going on outside us in the forests and the fields. Our bodies are part of that natural world. As much as anything else, our bodies, our minds, our thoughts, our feelings, that's the natural world which we share with others. You can't draw a line between where the natural world ends and you begin. You are part of it. You're in it. You're of it. And so the work you do inside yourself as a contemplative, let's say, is about realigning your own relationship with the phenomena of life itself. And you start within to stabilize this kind of mindful, aware perspective. But mindfulness is not just about closing in on yourself at all. It's not some self-indulgent exercise. It's actually establishing a foundation, a basis on which you can begin to relate to other people, other forms of life, plants, trees, the whole natural world beyond your body, from a similar perspective, one that is, in a way, rediscovering the mysterious, the mystical, the transcendent, if you like, or God, if you're a theist. In other words, you're no longer just skimming over the surface of life, just bouncing from one idea or one thought or one sensation to another. You find a depth within your experience that allows you to really get to grips with the core questions of who you are and what life is about. And I think all the religious and philosophical traditions have room for that. They might present it in different ways, they might have different priorities, but there I think we can begin to find a common ground. At the moment, I'm working on another book called An Ethics of Uncertainty, and this has led me into trying to find a common ground between the Buddha and Socrates. And I'm reading Plato at the moment. I'm completely absorbed in the Platonic dialogues. And Socrates, to me, is another key figure, absolutely central to our whole Western tradition. And yet Socrates is sort of hidden behind Plato, right, behind the metaphysics of Plato. Even the allegory of the cave is actually not Socratic, it's Platonic. I feel that Socrates, probably as much as we can reconstruct the historical Socrates, I don't think he would have had much truck with all of that theory. Because you're basically, the problem with the cave allegory is you've got two worlds again. You've got the real world and this messy, shadowy world.
Yeah. And
that's the problem, I think, in a lot of, whether East or West, is this deep human tendency to say, well, there's this transient, suffering, imperfect world we muddle through as we're alive, but there's something more. Right. There's some truer reality.
Yeah.
You can call it what you like. But as soon as you buy into that Platonic split, I think you have really compromised your ability to recognize, no, this is it.
Right. Yeah.
This is it. To believe in anything else is metaphysics. It's hypothetical. It's theoretical. It's consolatory, and it might even help explain things well, but it's not an immediate, concrete experience like the experience I'm having talking to you now and you have listening to me.
Right.
And it's to really try to recognize that there lies what is of ultimate importance. It's not life in some abstract sense, but life in a specific concrete sense, the breathing in and out each breath that we are doing now, and those who are listening to this are doing now. And that's why I find Buddhist meditation so radical in a way, is because it doesn't start with trying to, get into touch with God or reality. It starts with watching your breath. In fact, the classical text says, go into a forest and sit at the root of a tree or in an empty hut. And when you have a long breath, you know that it's a long breath. And when you breathe a short breath, you know that it's a short breath. That's where Buddhist contemplative practices starts. It starts with the raw, immediate physicality of your life moment to moment. That's mindfulness in its classical sense.
Right.
So there you have commonality. If we could get everybody to just recognize that fundamentally, irrespective of all you believe, all you desire, you're basically breathing in and out.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're a peasant in India or you are an executive in Tokyo, doesn't matter. You are the same basic being, and you are anatomically identical to your anatomy, your brain structure, everything is the same.
Right. Yeah.
I was reading a book, actually reading it just now while waiting for you, something like 938 elements of DNA are common to all forms of life on Earth.
Wow. Yeah.
Amazing piece of data, but it just shows that, at one level, we're no different from carrots and ducks and peanuts and grasses. It's all the same stuff. And this, I think, is the great revelation of the natural sciences, is to break down this two-world split.
Yeah, we are truly becoming, with all the research that's coming out for trees and the way they are all connected, and the fact that we actually share, like you said, like we share like 25% of DNA with trees or something.
Yeah, that's right. That kind of thing. It's incredible.
It's incredible.
And you don't think that when you look at a tree, it's something out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that commonality even is bigger than. I think there's a commonality obviously between humans. So, but you're actually talking about also you can sense even a more deeper commonality or a deeper connection to, like you said, the natural world. It doesn't stop with yourself. You are from it.
Yeah.
You're an exponent of the
totally interwoven with it. Totally interwoven with it.
But there's a cognitive way of saying this, and this interests me, or always interests me. So you can know there's something like knowledge, but you can, if you just keep it in your brain, so to speak, sometimes it doesn't connect with whatever it is, what is inside you. We could call it a soul. But whenever you recognize the knowledge for what it is inside of you with recognition, you can embody it. You can feel this knowledge being part of the way you see things. And the way you described there, it is all about we breathe in and we breathe out. And there, when you listen to Plato, it almost seems like there are two worlds. But you can also experience, in my experience with meditating, it's not so much as a split between two worlds, but there's a deeper understanding of the world you see.
That's right. Yeah, I agree. It's you see, where Socrates would differ from Plato is that Socrates will basically say, I don't know what reality is. Socrates is the great not knower. He says, I'm the wisest. They say I'm the wisest guy in the world.
Yeah.
But the only thing I'm really certain about is I don't know anything. Yeah. And this not knowing, this too, I think, is a very, very important part of this. Yes, we have knowledge, true, and we have extraordinary knowledge. We know about the DNA of trees. We know, it's amazing how much we know. But the problem with any kind of cognitive knowledge is that it operates within a sense of a subject and an object. Me and the DNA of trees, it's built into the very grammar almost of language and thought. What I like about Socrates, and I find it in the Buddha, I find it in the Taoists, Zhuangzi, for example,
right.
As well. And you find it in Greek philosophers like Pyrrho, Democritus and others, is that, in a sense, perhaps what's more important than what we know, our knowledge, is the acknowledgement of what we don't know, of our not knowing, of our really, the knowledge being, in a sense, like a very narrow beam of a torch that's very illuminating when you direct it to different things, but it only ever illuminates a tiny, tiny fraction of what's actually there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a contemplative practice, it's not so important in terms of what you get to know, but it's what you learn to acknowledge of what you don't know. And that's, to me, fundamental, is to be able to rest in not knowing. And not knowing is the flip side of curiosity and questioning and inquiry and wonder. Again, Socrates says that philosophy begins in wonder.
Right.
It begins in being able to recognize, what the hell is this? What is going on? In Zen Buddhism, you actually focus on questions, and you don't do so in order to get the answer.
No.
You do so in order to deepen the sense of what it means to be a questioning being.
Right.
And that's what Socrates says. He says that the wonder is the feeling of the philosopher.
Yeah.
The person who seeks wisdom, but is not at all not at all convinced that they'll ever actually arrive there.
So interesting, because it almost feels like it's the opposite side of science, which it isn't, because the biggest and the best scientists always have this curious mind.
Exactly.
But then science has this way of closing down on something. It's in my own experience, I started playing the piano when I was 10 years ago, when I was 25, so quite late. And I started learning, and when I first started learning playing the piano, I thought, okay, if I cross, metaphorically this pond, and I'll be at the other side, I know how to play the piano. But halfway through the pond, I was like in a river. And then halfway through the river, it felt like, okay, I have to cross this ocean. The more you know about something, the more your knowledge gets bigger on one subject, you see how little you know, which actually has this, I think it's a psychological phenomenon that is actually true, is people that know, that have large knowledge of something, actually are not willing to speak up as much as people who know very little about something.
Exactly. Well, that's the Socratic approach. Is the more you know, the less you know.
Right.
This is what sounds weird, and what I like about science is that it whatever claim it makes it in such a way that it can be disproved.
Right.
It's falsifiable. In other words, to claim certainty on the basis of science is actually it's not actually a scientific move. That's what people want. People crave certainty. They really want to know what's what. Science can give you, degrees of confidence in certain bits of information, but it will also say that what we are presenting is something that is where our knowledge has reached at this moment. That science only progresses by going beyond what is so far known. Right. And yet people like to think of scientific knowledge, and scientific knowledge is the new religious dispensation, and the scientists are the new priests, and that's often how they're treated. But as you say, I think the scientists are really, on the edge, who really are, the brilliant minds who come up with these ideas, have no such illusions. No. And the great thing about science is that it's an ongoing, never-ending quest for understanding. It's not arriving at a final set of knowledge where you can say, okay, universe, we've sorted that out now. We know what it's all about.
Done. Yeah.
That ain't gonna happen.
Which sounds to me like maybe a similarity also to you don't ever in your writings you don't write the Buddha, right? You write the Gautama mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it sounds like the way I've learned meditation is it's always with a curious mind. The moment you stop having a curious mind, it becomes torture, because then you have to find something.
Yeah, exactly. It's again, it's very difficult to get it. Like with Socrates, it's very difficult to know where Gautama ends and Buddhism begins, in the same way where Socrates ends and Plato begins.
Right.
But what appeals to me in the Buddha is the fact that he's offering us a way of life, a practice, a set of tasks to perform that will optimize our sense of what it means to be human. But that doesn't have to be grounded in some kind of ontological certainties, like that there is no self. That's become a Buddhist dogma, but weirdly, Gautama never said it. And yet you hear it everywhere. Most Buddhists believe this, but this is just another dogma. It's to me, one of the great passages in the early Buddhist texts is where Gautama is asked, is there a self? Silence. Is there not a self? Silence. In other words, he's not interested in saying is or is not. This is the case, this is not the case. What he's interested in doing is keeping an open, curious, questioning mind. And like Socrates, and what matters really is not what is or is not, but what you can do. Not how the world is what matters, but how the world ought to be is what matters. It's an ethical question. That Gautama and Socrates are ethicists. They're concerned with how do we lead a good life. That's, in a way, all that matters in philosophy. The rest is speculative metaphysics. And that's, of course, the most difficult question. How do I know what is good? How do I know what is right? How do I know what is just? That's the questions I feel we need to come together once more on this theme of commonality. How can we arrive at a deeper consensus around what it means to lead a good life? And that has to take into account the resources that we make use of. It has to take into account the social and political structures we live in. It has to take into account, the economic forces that we're so often beholden to. And this is a huge question. I mean, to think that you or I could somehow sort of come up with the answer to this and then everyone would follow, ain't gonna happen. It's got to be something that over probably generations that we require a massive change of mind. And I have to admit, again, from another point of view, you can argue, well, isn't that just pure idealism? Are human beings not always primarily going to be concerned with the survival of themselves and their children and their immediate families? It's all very well when we live in a comfortable, prosperous society like Holland or France, where we have lots of free time and we have lots of leisure and we have opportunities to improve ourselves, that, when things really get tough, as they are for the majority of people in this world who really are concerned with surviving, getting through the week, getting through the year. And that's as far as they can really, actively be concerned. Won't the power of those needs, of just basic survival needs, always trump the more collective, long-term needs to create a sustainable life on Earth for all beings? That is going to be an enormous struggle. And I think the world is probably overpopulated. It's impossible with the current population for everybody to live as a person would live in California. It's just not, the resources just aren't there. So we have to really consider what it means to lead a responsible life. And in terms of the usage and depletion of resources that is involved. And, people can have all these nice green philosophies, but are they really prepared to make the kinds of changes that may be required in order to, for others to be able to have, decent standards of living, education, healthcare?
Yeah.
I don't know.
No.
I can look at this very pessimistically.
Yeah. I can
Easy.
And would you say in your own life, would you say that there's an interesting line in your book where you say, after all these years of meditating, I couldn't say with complete certitude that it has made me a better man, something along those lines. But you would have to ask my wife or my brother or something. Did you ask? Do you know? Could you? how do you look back on that? Because you also write about your psychedelic experiences in the last couple of years with ayahuasca, and I got the sense that the experiences you had there were quite affirming in a sense. That was you led the life that was right for you.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think both are true. You see, I don't think we have to come down on the side of my life has been a success story from the word go, or my life has been a complete waste of time. It's somewhere between the two. And as you know, really, I'm being completely sincere here, is that yes, I have spent thousands of hours meditating. But I cannot hand on heart say, and that has made me a better person. I don't know. I think that that's not a judgment that the subject can make. And I'm quite serious when I say ask somebody else. But if I look at it even in a bigger frame, history would judge whether the things I've written and the things I've done, or anyone has written or done, are they going to survive and speak to further generations, or am I just really talking to, the present situation here in the 21st century? And like most things that are said and done in people's lives, within a few years, it'll be totally forgotten. That's very likely to be the case, I suspect. And yet we have this egotistic idea that what I'm doing is really important and it's going to make a big difference. And we don't know. We don't know. And that, as you say, it conflicts also with other key moments in people's lives, whether it be through taking ayahuasca or through falling in love or having children, or whatever it is, where we feel, yes, this is, something that I can deeply confirm as good and true. That's also true. It's a guessing game. We don't really know. I think the important thing really is to leave those sort of abstract questions behind and ask yourself, am I living my life optimally as I'm speaking to you now?
Right.
That's the only thing I'm really concerned about right now. It's not the other stuff. It's about, how am I communicating now? Am I getting across in a way that could impact other people's thinking and behavior in a way that would be supportive to them leading, what they would consider to be fuller and more contemplative and more responsible lives.
Yeah.
All that matters, I feel. The rest others will judge.
So that's coming back to how to live am I living the good life? Am I living a good life?
Exactly.
And I think you also mentioned Mandela in your book.
Yes.
How he talks about that. And that actually, it's so interesting that some cliches or maybe things that you've heard so many times can really be so full of truth. And you said it as well, your words matter. The speech, it has influence.
Mm-hmm.
It has, so if it matters where it comes from, where the speech comes from, what you say. So the first question before yourself is, what do I want to say?
Yeah, exactly.
What do I believe in? What is my
That's right.
thing to add?
No, that's a very good way to put it. And what it points to is that these sorts of questions are ongoing, and they're constantly dialectically involved in how we live in the world. In other words, what I say now, what I write in a book, I then pay attention to the consequences, how that then feeds back, the response I get, the reactions people have, positive, negative, and also the own development and refining of my own thinking. I see every book I write really as just a kind of a record of a particular life being led. And there are certain points every 5 years or so where I make a statement, I communicate that, and then I leave it behind. I never read my books again. That would be completely self-indulgent. But once one is done, on to the next. And it's the process that matters, and the constant process of learning, which requires humility, it requires openness, it requires a sense of humor.
Yeah.
Not taking yourself too seriously.
and that's something that Montaigne comes back to a lot, and
Yes.
had a contemplative life, and I think one of the biggest virtues he upholds, I think, is the cardinal is truth, being truthful.
Being truthful, yeah. Yes, he does. Being truthful. And that Socrates too, Buddha too. I mean, and I think it's an important distinction to make. To me, the truth is not about what is real, the truth. I'm very wary of that expression. I found the truth, capital T.
Yeah.
What is important is to live truth as a virtue. In other words, to lead a truthful life, to lead an honest life, both to oneself and to others. Truth is a practice, to be truthful, to be a true friend, for example, to try to reread truth, not as a way of talking about reality. God is truth, for example. That doesn't, I think, it's not so helpful. But do I live a truthful, honest, open, a life of integrity, really? But that requires that we do have in the background a set of values that we honor, one of which might be truthfulness. But I think we need a kind of all of us will have a set of values: kindness and tolerance and openness and sympathy. I mean, I think all there's no religion in the world that doesn't encourage those things. And they are the basic common human values. And there's even scientific explanations to explain why these have been selected, because they lead to social harmony and so forth and so on. And there, I think, we can find common ground.
Yeah.
And leave aside some of the more, divisive elements of our societies that, basically define us in opposition to the other.
Yeah.
That, I feel, is crucial to somehow break down.
It brings it back for me as well to, because all these words, truth, honesty, and curiosity, I think that they are all bundled together almost in the way in solitude, you can look at yourself.
Yes, that's right.
And it's quite difficult. I think that's also quite interesting to. Sometimes I facilitate groups, mainly with leaders of companies, and they're kind of distracted. That's what made them build these companies most of the times. But one of the assignments I give them after a couple of sessions is try to go out in the world for 6 hours in solitude. And 20% of them don't manage.
They don't manage to even start, or they don't manage to sustain it.
Sustain. So, and it's they just cannot. So some, after 1.5 hours walking, and they don't even have to meditate or anything. They can walk, and just can't. And for me, and they don't always see this as something frightful or something bad. It's just no, but I cannot do that. And for me, that's always such a amazing realization that for so many people, sitting down in meditation, or just for 6 hours, having no distractions, is a form of torture. So, and then also with really trying to look into yourself. I think curiosity is a beautiful word because it's soft. It really opens up the possibility to be truthful. But when things become still, things become clear as well. Not just the beauty of life, but also the muddly parts and the muddy parts.
Muddy parts, yeah.
And to really look it in the eye, I think in your article about extinction as well, our ego is not a big proponent of looking at the muddy part of life. It all wants the good part of life. We don't even want to acknowledge that we're going to die one day.
Exactly.
So maybe coming back also to what you say in your book, in the end, the task is not to choose between a life of solitude and a life of engagement, but to embrace both.
Yeah, that's right.
And learn how to find a healthy balance between them. So maybe coming back to, if we're looking forward in this communality, it is helpful to have people teach how to be curious and how to understand solitude and how to be honest and truthful, starting with yourself, because otherwise you can never be truthful with the world if you don't acknowledge your own faults.
That's right. Yeah, well, as you were talking, I was thinking really that in many ways this comes down to education, actually, how we bring up kids, how we train people to be responsible adults. We don't train them to in a sense, become more conscious of the inner workings of their own minds, their emotions, their feelings. That's kind of taboo. We don't train people to learn to be alone. Yet in traditional cultures, you take Native Americans, for example, going off and stick your kid on the mountain for 3 days. And that was my experience in India too. I did spend times all by myself up in the hills. And the idea sounds maybe either nice or a bit scary, but to do it, you really realize the extent to which you are kind of locked into certain attachments and fears and so on. And I think it's important to create situations in which people come to terms with their humanity, their mortality. Solitude opens up a kind of intimacy with our own existential being, our pulse, our heartbeat, our fears, our thoughts are suddenly all there, and there's nowhere to run. There's nowhere you can go to switch that off. And our society is basically a society of distraction.
Right.
Anything that if you're feeling uncomfortable about something, you don't like something, you have an easy way, myriad ways to switch off and switch on TV or check your Facebook account or whatever it might be, or whatever. But that, I feel, is an education that really is required if we are to enter into a radically new relationship with this world in which we live.
Right.
And that has to start at a young age.
Yeah.
That has to be built into into the education of children. And but without ramming it down their throats. This is the problem. Is if you present all kinds of good things to young people, if you present it in a kind of aggressive or forceful way, you'll have the opposite effect.
Right.
So it's a very, very difficult, challenge that if we're concerned about these issues, as you are, as I am, as I suspect people who are listening to this conversation, we really have to ask questions at many levels. There's no spiritual solution, and I don't think there's a political solution either. We require another way of being human, with greater awareness, greater vulnerability, greater curiosity, as you say. I agree. I think to constantly be questioning ourselves rather than just hanging on to the latest popular opinion.
Right.
Very challenging.
Very. And also it's like you said, there are many cultures where this was part of their culture, where it was ingrained. And we may have made the opposite culture. We have created a culture of reactive lives, of distraction. That's right. And what I just realized when you were talking about educating in this way, our education always consists of more knowledge, of learning with our brains, and this is actually education of doing, of experiencing, and of understanding the self. And has always amazed me when I first started studying philosophy. The questions were, what's the good life? What's ethical? What's not ethical? And these aren't questions that were asked at school, and that's actually pretty crazy, because
that's crazy. Yeah.
Never is there a moment where we reflect as children for what do you think is a good life? What do you think? How do you want to live? What's right for you? And also, do you understand yourself? Do you understand your own way of being in this world? And I agree with you completely that it has to start there. So maybe coming back to our earlier point in our conversation, where you said, I don't know what people like me who've been meditating for more than 20,000 hours in their life can contribute. Well, it is in a way helping us understand ourselves in solitude, and from that being curious about the world. and ourselves.
Yeah, that's true. I think if anything, what I've learned over all this time is to be suspicious of everything I believe, and to recognize the only thing I know for sure is that I'm questioning, which is actually where Descartes began too.
Yeah.
You know, the only thing that I know for sure is that I'm questioning myself. So yes, it is. Where do we take it from there? Well, that's another question. But without that foundation, I think we'll just keep on going around in circles in terms of what we already know, what's familiar, what's acceptable, what's comfortable. But we're confronting a situation that is not comfortable.
Right.
The crisis of the climate crisis, for example, is something that is, it's an existential threat, not just to human beings, but to myriad forms of life that have taken millions of years to evolve, highly complex organisms, and which every right, just as much right as we do to live on this earth.
Yeah.
And they have to be, embraced. Their needs have to be embraced.
Just one very last question.
Yes, go for it.
Could you maybe, for the last 1 minute, educate us in the ways of solitude? In a sense, could you maybe help us in a meditation?
Yeah, sure. That's a very good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, Mary. So let's conclude this conversation, not with more words, but with no words. And if you've done meditation before, then just do what you normally do. If you haven't, then just take a slightly different posture. If you're sitting on a chair leaning against the back, sit upright. Become conscious of your feet on the ground. Become conscious of your hands on your lap. And then become conscious of the fact that whether you like it or not, you're breathing. You're breathing in and you're breathing out. And the only way you know that you're breathing is because it creates a rhythm of physical sensations in your body. The air passing through the nostrils, down the windpipe, expanding the lungs, the belly, and then there's a pause, and then there's a contraction of belly, lungs, and slightly warmer air exits through your nostrils. And don't, when you meditate on the breath, feel you have to do it a certain way. Just let the body breathe as if you were not conscious of it. That's actually quite tricky. But just try to relax to the point where you can just observe and feel your breathing body. You are a breather. Just let it breathe. And as your mind settles, just open your attention to whatever's going on inside you, the emotions, the thoughts, the worries, the joys, the calm, the chaos. And that's okay too. That's just what is happening right now. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just your experience of being alive in this moment. And bring your awareness so that it's more centered in your body, in your belly, than in your head. Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you, Louis. I enjoyed our conversation very much.
Thank you, Stephen.
And,
Very much for your time.
I hope it's been of interest to those who've been listening as well.
Me too. It has been of great interest to me. So thank you for your time, and hope to see you and speak to you.
Okay.
You have been listening to an English episode of Back to Nature, the podcast of Club Groeneveld, with special thanks to Stephen Batchelor, Martien Groenendijk, Lonneke Rodens, and Marcel Tjepkema. Want to know more or join one of our programs? Follow us at Instagram or LinkedIn, subscribe to our newsletter, or visit us at www.clubgroeneveld.nl.